Strip away every Bible, every gospel, every sermon you've ever heard. Imagine none of it survived. No church kept a single copy. No monk ever picked up a quill to preserve a single verse. Now ask yourself an uncomfortable question. If the only evidence left behind came from the people who hated this movement, the historians, the bureaucrats, the empire that eventually tried to crush it, would there be enough left to prove a man named Jesus ever actually lived and died in Roman Judea? It turns out there is. Not much, barely a few hundred words, scattered across a handful of documents written by men who had no reason to help Christianity's case. And those scraps of hostile, indifferent, official Roman and Jewish record-keeping are some of the most fought-over sentences in the history of ancient scholarship. This isn't an argument anyone needs to win for you. It's a genuine historical puzzle, the kind professional historians have been quietly working through for well over a century, weighing fragments of evidence with the same rigor they'd apply to any other ancient figure, regardless of what any of them personally believe about Christianity's larger claims. Oh, and once you actually walk through what survives, line by line, source by source, you start to understand exactly why both the people who want to use this evidence as a slam-dunk proof and the people who want to dismiss it outright are, in their own ways, oversimplifying something that deserves far more care than either side usually gives it. Let's set the stakes properly first, because the reason this evidence matters so much is precisely how little of it there is. Jesus of Nazareth lived and died in one of the most thoroughly documented corners of the ancient Mediterranean world, under direct Roman administration, during a period when the empire kept extensive bureaucratic records of executions, uprisings, and provincial unrest. And yet, almost none of that contemporary Roman record survives today. For the same reason, almost nothing from antiquity survives. Papyrus rots, fires burn libraries, empires fall, and the archives fall with them. Historians studying figures like Jesus aren't comparing the New Testament against some rich, untouched Roman filing cabinet. They're working with the same kind of fragmentary, accidental survival that governs almost everything we know about the ancient world, where a single surviving copy of a single book, hand-copied by a single scribe, centuries after the original was lost, can be the entire reason we know something happened at all. That's exactly the situation with the first and most significant piece of outside evidence for Jesus, a passage buried in the work of a Jewish historian named Flavius Josephus. Josephus was not some marginal figure. Born around the year 37, he commanded Jewish forces in Galilee during the early stages of the Jewish revolt against Rome, the very region where Jesus had grown up and preached only a few years earlier, before eventually surrendering to the Romans, gaining the favor of the emperor's family and spending the rest of his life in Rome writing detailed histories of his own people. He was, by training and temperament, exactly the kind of meticulous, well-connected chronicler historians love to find. Someone who had personally lived through the events and political world he was describing, who had access to Jewish religious authorities, court records, and oral testimony from people who had been adults during Jesus' lifetime and the decades immediately following it. This wasn't a writer working centuries after the fact, from second-hand legend. Josephus was completing Antiquities barely 60 years after the crucifixion. Well within living memory for some of the oldest people he would have spoken with directly. Around the year 93 or 94, he completed this sprawling work, tracing Jewish history from creation up through his own lifetime. Buried in Book 18 is a short paragraph, roughly 90 words long in the original Greek, describing a wise teacher named Jesus, his execution under the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, awe in the persistence of his followers afterward. Scholars call it the Testimonium Flavianum, the testimony of Flavius. Here's where the story gets genuinely complicated, in exactly the way real historical evidence almost always does. As the passage survives in nearly every Greek manuscript copy we have today, it reads less like the work of a Jewish historian and more like a Christian creed. It states outright that Jesus was the Messiah, that he appeared to his followers alive again on the third day, and that prophets had foretold these things, language almost no scholar believes a non-Christian Jewish writer of the first century would have used about a rival religious figure he didn't personally follow. For centuries, that's made the passage deeply suspicious. And the leading explanation among modern historians is that later Christian scribes, copying and recopying Josephus' work across the centuries, didn't fabricate the entire passage out of nothing, but rather took a shorter, more neutral original description and edited it, embellishing it with explicitly Christian language as it passed through Christian hands during the long process of manuscript transmission that kept Josephus' work alive at all. The case for that theory got a fascinating piece of supporting evidence in the 20th century. In 1971, a scholar named Shlomo Pines published research on an entirely different surviving version of the passage, preserved not in Greek, but in Arabic, inside a 10th century history book written by a Christian bishop named Agapius. Because this Arabic text descended through an entirely separate manuscript tradition than the standard Greek copies of Josephus, one that passed through different hands, different regions, and different centuries of transmission, it offered scholars something rare, an independent check on whether the more dramatic Greek wording had been there from the beginning or had crept in somewhere along the way. That Arabic version describes Jesus in far more measured, far less devotional terms, a good and virtuous man whom many people followed, who was condemned to crucifixion by Pilate, and whose followers reported afterward that he had appeared to them alive. No outright declaration that he was the Messiah, no claim that prophets had specifically foretold his resurrection as established fact. What many scholars who've studied this Arabic version believe it may preserve something much closer to what Josephus actually wrote. A respectful but clearly non-Christian description of a controversial religious teacher, stripped of the later devotional embellishments that crept into the Greek manuscript tradition over the centuries that followed. Most historians working on this question today land somewhere in the middle, and it's worth sitting with that nuance rather than flattening it into a simple yes or no. The dominant scholarly position isn't that the entire Testimonium Flavianum is fake, and it isn't that it's entirely authentic exactly as it survives either. It's that Josephus most likely did write something about Jesus in this exact spot in his history. Probably brief, probably skeptical, or at least neutral in tone, and that later Christian copyists, working through a manuscript tradition that passed through Christian hands for nearly 2,000 years before reaching us, smoothed and expanded it into the more triumphant language we now read. There's a second, far less disputed reference to Jesus, sitting just 2 books later in the same work, and it's arguably more valuable specifically because nobody seriously argues it was altered. In Book 20 of Antiquities, describing events in the year 62, Josephus recounts the death of a man named James, executed by the Jewish high priest Ananus during a brief gap in Roman governance after the previous governor had died and his replacement hadn't yet arrived to take up the post, leaving Ananus free to act without the usual Roman oversight he would otherwise have had to answer to. Josephus identifies this James in passing as, in his own words, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. That phrasing matters enormously. It's a small, almost throwaway aside, exactly the kind of detail a writer includes when he assumes his audience already knows roughly who he's talking about and doesn't need elaborate context. The historical equivalent of someone today casually mentioning a public figure's relative without pausing to explain who the public figure was. It also lines up precisely with the New Testament's own description of James, identified in Paul's letter to the Galatians as the Lord's brother, and later church tradition consistently described this same James as a leading figure in the early Jerusalem church. Because this passage carries none of the theological language that makes the first reference so contested, the overwhelming majority of historians, including scholars who are skeptical of the longer testimonium, accept this brief mention as authentic, making it one of the clearest non-Christian references to Jesus surviving from the ancient world. Roughly 2 decades after Josephus finished writing, evidence of an entirely different kind shows up, this time from deep inside the machinery of Roman imperial administration itself. Around the year 112, a Roman governor named Pliny the Younger, overseeing the province of Bithynia in what is now northern Turkey, wrote a letter to the Emperor Trajan asking for guidance. This wasn't a casual correspondence. Pliny was an experienced, careful administrator, the kind of official who didn't bother the emperor with trivial matters. And the fact that he felt compelled to write directly to Trajan about this particular issue tells you something about how seriously Rome was beginning to take this once obscure offshoot of Judaism. He'd been encountering a growing number of people identifying as Christians, and he wasn't sure how to handle the legal situation, how harshly to punish them, whether age or recantation should matter, what counted as sufficient evidence. His letter describes interrogating these Christians directly, in some cases under torture, and learning that they gathered before dawn on a fixed day to sing a hymn to Christ as if to a god, bound themselves by oath to avoid theft, adultery, and fraud, and shared a meal of ordinary harmless food. This isn't a record of Jesus' life or death directly. It's something different and, in its own way, just as valuable, a snapshot of an actual Roman administrator decades after the crucifixion, treating Christianity as a real, organized, geographically widespread religious movement significant enough to require a direct ruling from the emperor himself on how the imperial government should respond to it. Trajan's reply survives too, and it's almost as revealing as the original letter, instructing Pliny not to actively hunt Christians down but to punish them if formally accused and convicted, a glimpse into exactly how uncertain, improvised, and genuinely undecided Rome's relationship with this new religion still was, generations after its founder's death. Around that same period, a Roman senator and historian named Cornelius Tacitus, a contemporary and personal friend of Pliny's, wrote his own account touching on Christianity, this time explaining the aftermath of the catastrophic fire that devastated Rome in the year 64. Tacitus was, by the standards of the day, about as credible and well-positioned a witness as Roman history offers. He served as a senator, held the consulship, and later governed a Roman province himself, giving him direct, first-hand familiarity with exactly the kind of imperial administrative machinery, court proceedings, and provincial governance he was describing. He explicitly tells readers elsewhere in his work that he drew on official Senate records and state archives in constructing his histories, the same kind of institutional documentation that would have recorded a provincial governor's decisions regarding executions and unrest. In his Annals, completed sometime around the year 116, Tacitus describes how the Emperor Nero, facing rumors that he himself had ordered the city burned, shifted the blame onto a group, in Tacitus's own words, hated for their abominations, popularly called Christians. He then adds the detail historians have spent over a century arguing about. Christus, Tacitus writes, from whom that name derived, had been executed during the reign of Tiberius by one of the Roman governors, a man named Pontius Pilate. That single sentence is remarkable for what it casually confirms. A senior Roman senator, writing decades later in an official history, aimed at an educated Roman audience with no interest in defending Christianity, independently records the same basic facts found in the Gospels, that Jesus was a real historical figure, that he was executed specifically under Pontius Pilate's administration, and that his movement, despite that execution, hadn't disappeared, but had instead spread, reaching as far as the capital of the empire itself. Most scholars consider this passage to be genuinely written by Tacitus, rather than a later Christian insertion. In part because Tacitus's tone toward Christians here is openly hostile and dismissive, describing their beliefs as a destructive superstition, language no Christian forger would have any obvious reason to invent on the religion's own behalf. There's an active scholarly debate worth being honest about here because pretending otherwise would oversell the certainty involved. Some historians argue Tacitus may not have arrived at this information independently at all, suggesting he likely drew on his friendship and correspondence with Pliny, possibly even on Pliny's own letter to Trajan, or conversations between the two men, rather than on separate Roman administrative archives documenting Pilate's tenure in Judea decades earlier. If that's correct, it doesn't make Tacitus's account worthless, but it does mean these two famous Roman sources may not be as fully independent of each other as they're sometimes presented. More like two closely connected branches of the same root than two entirely separate trees. Responsible historians today tend to flag that complexity rather than smooth past it, because that's what taking the evidence seriously actually requires. There's a fourth, smaller piece of evidence worth including here, mostly because it's so genuinely ambiguous that it illustrates exactly how careful this kind of historical work has to be. The Roman biographer Suetonius, writing his Lives of the 12 Caesars sometime around the year 121, mentions in his account of the emperor Claudius that Jews in Rome were expelled from the city because they were, in his words, constantly causing disturbances at the instigation of a man called Christus. That expulsion is independently corroborated by the New Testament's book of Acts, which describes a Jewish couple named Aquila and Priscilla, leaving Rome specifically because Emperor Claudius had ordered all Jews out of the city, placing the same historical event in both an outside Roman source and an early Christian text. Whether Suetonius's Christus actually refers to Christ himself, or to some otherwise unknown local agitator who happened to share a similar-sounding name, has divided scholars for well over a century, since the spelling doesn't precisely match the Greek term for Christ, and the timing, around the year 49, would place the unrest roughly 2 decades after the crucifixion. Some historians read it as garbled, second-hand knowledge of disputes breaking out in Roman synagogues over the spread of early Christian teaching about Jesus as the Messiah, with the disturbance and its long-dead namesake getting conflated decades later by a biographer working from incomplete records. Others think it's simply an unrelated, unknown troublemaker who happened to share a common name. It's a genuinely uncertain piece of evidence, and reputable historians are honest about that uncertainty rather than forcing it to say more than it actually can. So what does the complete, honest picture actually look like, once you set aside both the overconfident claims on one side and the dismissive ones on the other? It looks like exactly what historians of the ancient world typically work with whenever they study a small, regional, and at the time, deeply unremarkable religious movement. Not an avalanche of independent eyewitness documentation. A handful of brief scattered references, some clearer than others, some altered by the very process of being copied and preserved over centuries, written by men who had no theological stake in Christianity's success, and, in Tacitus's case, openly despised what it had become. It's also worth saying plainly that the position arguing Jesus never existed at all, sometimes called the mythicist position, remains a genuinely marginal view within professional ancient history and biblical scholarship, held by very few credentialed historians and rejected by the overwhelming majority of specialists working in the field, including a great many who hold no religious belief whatsoever and have no theological, investment in the outcome either way. That's worth noting precisely because it cuts against the assumption some people carry that historians are quietly divided on this question the way they are on, say, the more contested details of Tacitus's sourcing. They aren't. The basic existence of Jesus of Nazareth is about as close to settled historical consensus as anything from this period gets, even while individual pieces of evidence, like the exact original wording of the Testimonium Flavianum, remain very much alive subjects of careful, ongoing scholarly debate. Strip away the Gospels entirely, and what remains is still enough for the overwhelming majority of historians, across a remarkably wide range of personal religious belief and disbelief, to treat the existence of a historical Jesus of Nazareth, executed under Pontius Pilate, as about as well established as most other figures from the ancient world we never seriously doubt existed at all. What makes this evidence compelling isn't that it's dramatic, it's that it's almost boring in exactly the way real historical record-keeping usually is. A historian making a passing remark about a defendant's brother, a governor filing a routine administrative question with his emperor, a senator explaining a fire by way of a group he personally found repulsive, a biographer noting an expulsion order almost in passing, decades after the fact, possibly garbling a name in the process. None of these men were trying to build a case for anything. They weren't defending a faith or attacking one. They were simply doing their jobs, recording the world as bureaucrats and historians do, filling out the unglamorous paperwork of empire. And somewhere inside that ordinary, indifferent record-keeping, Jesus of Nazareth left just enough of a mark to still be visible nearly 2,000 years later, in the words of people who had absolutely no reason to want him remembered at all. If stories like this are the kind that actually keep you watching, the real ones, built on primary sources, you can go read for yourself rather than something somebody simply claimed, an AI said, hit subscribe, so the next one finds you, and share this with someone who's only ever heard one side of this argument.